everybody go around the table here. We got the WAC committee here, which is the Watershed Advisory Committee members here. We have the TAT Advisory Committee members. We have the Lake Committee members, and we also have some council members here. So I would like to start.
Sorry, we can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Like I said, I'm going to have the members of the WAC and TAC and the Lake Committee go around the table here, and then those back there sitting in the gallery can stand up and introduce themselves. And also, I noticed we have some council members in here too that can introduce themselves. So, and then when that introduction is done, I'll turn it over to Mike, and then he can introduce himself and the team. So we'll start with you, okay?
Brian Temple, and I'm on the technical advisory team as well as the Lake Metro Advisory Committee.
Mike Kuchera, Lake Advisory Committee.
John McLeod, Lake Advisory Committee.
Paula Macer, I'm on the technical advisory team.
I'm Greg Kipp. I'm a geological engineer and geochemist, and I'm from Rapid City here with Mike and the FYRA team.
Sarah Mechtenberg. I'm an environmental engineer with FYRA Engineering.
Charles Eichenberry. I'm with FYRA Engineering.
Mike Sotek, also with FYRA Engineering.
Justin Peasy, I'm on the Watershed Board.
Colin Kierkegaard, I'm on the Watershed Advisory Committee.
Kevin Thurman, Golf and Cemetery Department, City Watershed Advisory Committee.
Mark Pitts on the Watershed Advisory Committee and the Lake Mitchell Advisory Committee.
Okay, and if we can start back there on the left side over there in the front and work our way back and go over to the other side.
Steve Roth, Park
Can you please stand up, Steve? Can each one of you stand up back so we can see who you are?
Lauren Van Overshield, Watershed Advisory Committee.
Kevin McCarl, City Council.
Becky Pitts, Technical Advisory Team.
John Dusher, Council.
Justin Johnson, City Attorney.
Steve Rice, City Council.
Stephanie Elwine, City Administrator.
Susan Chark, City Council.
Steve Donovan with Ducks Unlimited on the Technical Advisory Team.
Kevin Erdman on the Technical Advisory Committee. Dwight Scott on the Technical Advisory Committee.
Julie Olson, Technical Advisory Committee.
Dave Bartle, Manager, James River Water Development. I'm on the Technical Advisory.
Okay, we now all know each other. So I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. We've got a sign-in sheet here just to kind of keep records. If we could start that around, and when you get a chance to sign in, and so we keep correspondence going there. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what we're going to do tonight, talking a little bit to the agenda here, and then I'm going to let Charles and Sarah do the majority of the presentation. You're also going to hear from Greg as well. And so a little bit of a background, I guess, recently is, so where we're at right now is we've submitted what we've called a draft report. It's certainly not complete by any means, and on the way up here, giving it another read, I found a few typos and stuff that I wish I would have seen before, but don't want you to think or judge it in terms of it being complete, 100% complete. It's not. The goal of tonight is to do two things. Is number one, give you a real sound update of where we're at in the process and what our findings are, but also talk about how to complete this project, because we can't complete this phase of the project without input from you and ultimately from the public, as well, as we've always kind of stated from the start with community-based planning process. There have been a couple of unique challenges come up recently. In one of the things, as you know, and I know there's a little frustration over the summer with things moving rather slowly, and the reason they were moving slowly is because we're collecting a lot of data. You're going to see tonight why it was important that we were collecting that data, and one of the things that came out of the data that was a little bit of a surprise to us was the component of the project that dealt with the phosphorus delivery to the lake from the watershed. A big component of that being dissolved instead of sediment-attached phosphorus really changes things around. We've dealt with it before, but it is a bit of a new paradigm in terms of how we address the problem, because most of the projects that go on right now, when you talk about phosphorus limiting factors and what we want to do to bring lakes into a better water quality state, has to do with let's take sediment out of the system and let's take the phosphorus that's attached to that sediment, and that brings it out of the system, lake cleans up. That's not necessarily going to work here. So add that on to the fact that we knew that we were dealing with a tremendous amount of load due to the watershed size to lake ratio. And to be honest, when I first started this project, I thought, who's the crazy man who designed this lake and put this little tiny lake at the bottom of this watershed? And now that we've got into the information and done our water mass balance model, et cetera, it makes a lot more sense. There's very little water coming out of this watershed for the size of it. And so I think if you move south into Kansas and Iowa and Oklahoma and Missouri, somebody who built something that big would just be asking for trouble. But it's kind of the norm up here. And so maybe the people who built this and designed this structure back in the 20s knew a lot more than what they were doing than the gut reaction was, because the lake isn't always full in late summer, as you know. And so what that says is that you need a watershed that big to keep the lake full. But that also brings some of the challenges that come with the watershed and what we're going to learn about specifically some of the soils in the watershed and what they're doing to add to that nutrient load to the lake, okay? So what we're going to do, if we look at the agenda on the board here, we're going to talk about what we know right now. We're going to talk about how we know it. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the unknowns. From those, we do have some preliminary management scenarios we're going to talk to you about, because the purpose of this phase was to get a handle on what the status is and how the lake works dynamically. And number two, to start letting you know what theoretically could it take to make this lake and reach some of the water quality goals that we want to make. That's one of the things we need to do, is refine the goals. And then we're also going to talk about, in those management scenarios, I know Nathan kind of prepped you all that you may see a little bit of sticker shock. We've still got some great ideas to bring costs down. And we're going to talk about some of those, what we call the cost reduction strategies in terms of data collection, continued data collection, and design refinement. Then we need to talk to you a little bit about goal refinement, because that really has a big factor to do with what's ultimately going to be the cost of the lake and what are you willing to live with. Because there's at some point there's an unaffordable project, and we certainly don't want to be at that point, but we want to do whatever we can to say, what are we willing to live with? We know that the lake has worked well in the past and has been a great lake to recreate in the past. We know as a minimum we want to get back to somewhere close to that, as close as we can. So we're going to talk about the initial talks, what we did about goal refinement, and then talk about what might it take to get to those. Then we're going to talk about just the next step in terms of finishing out this phase and what we would propose for additional phases. And then we need to get some feedback from you on where we're going. What looks good, FYRA? What do we need more information on? What are some lingering questions there? So one thing I want to point out real quick is that as a part of this process, when we got into this dissolved phosphorus issue, that begins to get a little bit closer to out of our comfort zone and what we wanted to do. And so Greg Kipp, who you all met before, I know the WAC and the TAT met him when we met over there in the rec facility before. Greg has done some consulting for us on other lake projects. He's a geochemist. You're going to soon learn that he's a funny guy and one of the smartest guys you'll ever meet. So he has been added to the team. Our intention is to finish this phase of the project with Greg. We're paying for his costs under the original contract. But if the project moves forward into future phases, and you're going to see why, we're going to have Greg involved with the project as well. And we're excited about that, and Greg's excited about that too. So with that, I'm going to step back. I'm going to let Charles and Sarah run the majority of what's up in front of us, and then talk to you about later in the project, I guess, or the presentation.
All right, so who here read through the entire TM? Good, good. I don't want to get too into the weeds, so we provided as much of that detail as we could in that technical memo, so that might help things speed up. Instead of 70 slides, we have about 35, so that's good. And as Mike mentioned, so starting it off, the watershed size, the watershed to lake ratio that we are talking about. On average, traditional lakes often have a ratio 40 to 50 to 1. 40 acres of watershed to 1 acre of lake. And what we're seeing here is more in the realm of 500 to 1. And that, along with more water, comes the nutrients that run off from it and that feed the lake. So that's sort of one of our, number one findings from the information we went through. There's lots of information out there. You said it was a little bit quiet for the past 3 months. Well, that's because we've been doing a lot of reading, a lot of looking at the data, and that takes a lot of time to go through. And we put together a timeline of our understanding of what has all happened. Studies go back, 1974 even, starting to look, water supply. And then they start shifting towards water quality. What can we do to improve water quality in the watershed? And lots has been done, but when you look at lake numbers and your phosphorus concentrations and the quality of the lake, it's still struggling.
And what we'll do, and we'll try to bring this into the presentation, we brought it into the TM, I think, and we'll improve upon that, but we will try to draw out of those historical studies, those past studies, how those might confirm, or how our findings might confirm what was been observed in the past, or if there's significant differences, we'll try to draw those out and point to those as well as we go through the night.
Mm-hmm. And just for a little perspective, just looking at the numbers real quick. Whoop, whoop. These numbers, what's the goal? What should it be? These numbers are, in the hundreds to almost thousands at times, and we'd like to see them below 100. So just if you're trying to get some perspective, that's what we're looking at. Nutrients tend to be more of the problem. When you look at sediment, look at past historical loads of sedimentation in the lake, we don't have a lot of sediment buildup, where it's more the nutrients that we're focusing on. And through all that modeling we did of the watershed, we found that loading rates per acre in the watershed are not that high but it's just adding them all together, adding all that 500-to-1 ratio, adding that all together is where your issues kind of start to build up. So sometimes, I don't know if you can see these numbers, but they're around 0.2. High loading rates are 3 to 4 pounds per acre, and we're only seeing 0.2 pounds per acre. So that really gives you perspective that, it's not an individual per acre problem, it's just the addition of it all together.
What that also means is that in order to see significant gains in water quality in the lake, we've got to reduce what's already a pretty small number. So it just means that it's going to be that much harder to get those benefits from the watershed itself, because on a per acre basis, there's really not all that high. So it's kind of like trying to squeeze that last bit of juice out of an orange. There's really just not that much there to squeeze in terms of traditional agricultural conservation practices up in the watershed.
Go ahead.
So this comes directly from the data that was collected, has been collected historically, and is then entered into our water balance and nutrient mass balance model. Mike touched on it, Sarah did as well. There's high dissolved phosphorus content. In fact, if you look at the blue line here, that is over this period of time, 2005 to 2014 or 15, the cumulative dissolved phosphorus load coming into the lake over that period of time. And the red line is the total phosphorus coming into the lake over that period of time. And then the green dashed line is the ratio of that dissolved fraction to the total phosphorus. And what you see is that it's right around 70%, 65, 66% of the total phosphorus is of dissolved form.
Can you tell us what that means?
It's going to come into a lot of the discussion later.
Okay, so define.
Yes, so we have this total amount of phosphorus coming into the lake from the watershed, from FYRA Steel Creek, and some of that is attached to sediment. So as you have erosion from sheet and rill erosion from cropland or pasture or from the stream bed and bank itself, that's carrying phosphorus. The rest of the phosphorus is not attached to anything, it's just dissolved in the water.
Okay.
So that's going to impact how the lake responds. It's also going to impact what can be done about it. It's a different approach to address that dissolved phosphorus portion. Is that clear?
Is the source of dissolved and the source of
Total.
sediment attached?
Yeah.
Is the source the same?
In some cases, yes, but in many cases, no. And we really will get into that in some detail
sorry, I
later.
won't
But no,
ask
those
you.
are all
No,
very,
please do.
very good questions. Yes.
Please keep asking questions.
So there are certain things that will contribute both sediment attached and dissolved, and then there are other sources that will contribute more of one than the other.
Okay, thanks.
Good question.
I have a question. A question about questions. Is it better to wait till the end of your presentation to ask questions?
My take on that is if you have a question that's really going to prevent you from, taking in the information as we go forward, I would encourage you to go ahead and ask so you don't get stuck and feel like you're left behind. But otherwise, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end for general questions. So take some notes and then drill us at the end.
We may get to what your question is,
Yep.
in a few slides.
Yep. One of the other issues here has to do with the water balance, and that is because of that watershed lake ratio, again, we're flushing a lot of water through that lake, so it essentially turns over, or the volume of water coming in replaces the existing volume about 3 times a year. That's a residence time issue, and that also will drive how the lake responds to nutrients, and then will drive what we can do about it. Sarah, I'm going to let you take this one.
Yeah.
Or not.
No, yeah. So basically what we learned is the proportion of the load, after all the modeling we did, approximately half is coming from inside of the lake. The internal load that Charles and Kip, we'll discuss the methods in which the phosphorus is released from the lake bed itself. The internal load is approximately half of what we found is contributing to the problem. The watershed load is approximately half.
Yep.
So
So you see these numbers here, 44.9 is the watershed load, so 53% and 47% is about where we're at.
And so to reach our goals, just getting rid of half, if we just erased half the load, the lake they still wouldn't get down to the concentrations where we need to be. So really it has to be, this kind of just sets up when we're looking at our alternatives. We can't just ignore one or the other. We have to find a way to address both in order to see the water and quality improvements that would prevent the algae blooms in the future. So all of those things that we know, we just kind of want to give you a little bit of background. I know you read through the technical memo of what do we base all of that on. Like we said, we read through those reports. We gleaned out the information. That 1997 feasibility study that did a very detailed, probably even more detailed survey of the watershed. They found out surveys of cattle heads and where they're located, and it had a lot of good information on these cattle sources, and that was a lot of what they focused on. So we took that for what it's worth, and so we know that that is an issue in the watershed. And we could use that, as to the source of the phosphorus. Is that the main source? And then that's something we continue to look at as we went along. Go ahead.
Another thing we did really is just go back and try to compile all the existing flow and water quality data that we could. So what you see here are 2 plots. They're a little bit involved, so I'm going to try to direct your attention to what really matters. And so as you start on the left-hand side of both plots here, these are high flow conditions. And then where the dots are located, those are phosphorus concentrations that occur or that have been observed, at least historically, within each of those flow conditions. So we've got high flow on the left and very low flow drought conditions really on the right. And every dot represents a time that somebody went out there, grabbed a sample from FYRA Creek, took it back to the lab and had it analyzed. Okay? It looks like a lot of data. It's a pretty good amount of data. What we'd normally like to do is have a data point of phosphorus concentration for every day that we have flow. We don't have near that number of phosphorus concentrations. That requires a lot more work, a lot more cost to analyze phosphorus than it does to have a flow measuring device in the stream. So the way we've analyzed that data is to, again, group it into these different flow conditions and then use the median flow that we typically observe, and that's these little horizontal dashed lines. That's essentially the typical or the average flow of each flow condition. And what you see is generally higher concentrations at high flows. That makes sense. Some of that is that sediment attached portion. There's enough flow there to have caused upland erosion, and that moves through the system. That's going to have a higher total phosphorus concentration. The 2 different graphs, by the way, are dissolved phosphorus and that total portion, which includes dissolved plus that attached portion, sediment attached. So higher flows, higher concentrations. We see a little bit of a high concentration in extreme low flows. That's actually very informative. That tells us a little bit about that source. Typically, when you see high concentrations at low flows, that means there's something going on out there every day that's adding kind of a constant, steady source of phosphorus to the system. So that would include things, and this won't apply so much to FYRA, but if you had wastewater treatment plants that are discharging continuously, that'll tend to be something that brings up those low flow concentrations, where these events over here are largely weather-driven events. That's just an example. So that also gives us a little bit more information about what's causing, what are the primary contributors to this and what can we do about it.
One thing I want to point out, the concentrations that we're at here, like we were saying, in our lake, we want the water, to be in around the 100, below 100. The levels of the water coming in are around 1,000 during your high events.
This would be 100 right here.
So
this is a log scale,
the
so that's a
water
little deceiving.
feeding your reservoir, that's what we have to work with right now.
So Sarah's saying we want to be about right here all the time, and we're clear up here at 1, which is 10 times that, especially in high flow conditions.
So this is just a little background. When we did develop a watershed model to kind of break down the load. So when you have your watershed, it takes into account what is your land use, what's going on, what are your cattle counts, what's all the information you can put into a watershed model. And it can help you allocate where's your load coming from, what is the source, break it down between cropland and pasture land and stream bank erosion, and it helps give you, it's not going to be perfect, but it helps provide good perspective.
The other thing, and this is what will drive a lot of the conversation that follows from this point, is our water balance and nutrient mass balance modeling. So what we wanted to look at there includes all the different pathways which water enters and leaves the lake. We've talked about dissolved versus attached and low flow versus high flow. Now we're going to talk about pathways. So obviously we have flows coming into the lake from the watershed, Firesteel Creek predominantly, but also those areas adjacent to the lake that contribute to the lake that don't actually flow through the stream system. We also have a little bit of groundwater flowing into the lake, and we have, of course, direct precipitation that falls on the lake. And then in the case of Mitchell, especially at least historically, there was some pumping involved, pumping from the James River, for example. So we have captured all of those different pathways of water entering the lake. The red arrows show the opposite. That's water leaving the lake. So surface water evaporation from the lake on those warm, sunny days when the water heats up. We have some irrigation going on and some other consumptive uses of the lake. Historically, we know it was used for water supply, not the case anymore. But that was taking phosphorus out of the lake as well. Of course, water flowing over the spillway and on through the FYRA system, eventually to the James River, that carries some phosphorus. Groundwater flowing out of the lake can take a little bit of phosphorus with it, depending on what's going on down there in terms of groundwater hydrology. So those are your external pathways for water coming into the lake. Some of those pathways include phosphorus, some of them do not. Of course, flow from Firesteel will also include phosphorus. Direct precipitation or atmospheric deposition, wind brings some dust in and some soil particles. That actually does have a measurable amount of phosphorus coming in with it just from just dry deposition and wet deposition, rainfall and wind and dust, but that's typically pretty small. If you're pumping from a source like the James River, obviously that's going to bring some phosphorus. That water's not pristine. And then groundwater can have varying levels of nutrient concentrations as well. Kind of the same thing on the external side. I won't go through those, but what you see here in the middle is something that often gets overlooked, and that's that sediment at the bottom of the lake. It contains a really high level of phosphorus within the sediments just sitting there at the bottom of the lake. And we're going to get into this in great detail a little later. But at times, under the right conditions, that sediment becomes available and is redistributed or released up into the water column. And that really is bad news for water quality in Lake Mitchell. Phosphorus coming in also settles, and you have this internal cycle that's going on within our lake, as well as everything that's coming into and leaving. And how we've assessed that here is through our model, and these are just a couple of screenshots that show what our model looks like when you get in there and start to look around. So the first thing and the most important thing with a modeling approach such as this is to make sure we're getting a good handle on the water budget. If we can't get the water budget right, we're not going to have even a puncher's chance of doing a good job simulating phosphorus. So the blue dots that you see here are all the historical observations of water levels in the lake. The city's kept really good records here, and the red line there is the projected or the simulated water level in our model. And so you can see, I know the scale is probably hard. If you're in the back of the room, I apologize. But you can see that red line really does follow the blue dots pretty well, simulating both the peaks and those low water conditions pretty well. We've got some places in here where we don't have a lot of data, so we have some gaps, but that's pretty good data. I will point out these vertical lines here, they're pretty faint. That indicates historical pumping. So when you see those vertical lines, that means you're pumping to the lake from the James at that point in time. Oh, there was one problem area here. This really concerned me for a while until I realized that was the period which you were doing some work on the spillway. And so that's not, we didn't change the spillway configuration during construction of your spillway repair and renovation project. So when you see that variation there where the red line's not hitting those blue dots, that's a product of not of the model performing poorly, but of a product of something going on that we just didn't get in that model. So that's I would say I'm very pleased with those results. We're simulating water elevations. That means we're hitting that water balance really well. There's a lot that went into that. I just breezed over hours of work. Happy to answer questions if you have more detailed questions about the model at the end. This is the same kind of analysis, but for phosphorus concentrations. Now, our period where we really tried to focus on here was back in 2001 and following. That's when you had the most phosphorus data available to try to refine our model, get our model working well. And you can see there, a little bit more difficult to predict phosphorus on a daily level than it is flow or water level. These gray bars here represent the alum demonstration project that was done in 2003, 4, 5, and 6. And those even, you can see, actually work pretty well. If we could zoom in on that, you would see how the observed concentrations fell during that alum application and shortly thereafter, and then jump back up. And the model represents that very well also.
How much time between the fall and the rise?
In those old applications, we're talking weeks. And we'll get into why that is. So, we have a lot of information we've brought into the TM and a lot more information we could present tonight on what we've learned and how we learned that. But there are some pretty important unknowns yet that are going to drive the solutions going forward. We talked about the dissolved phosphorus. I don't want to get into that too much more other than to say it's difficult to tell at this time whether that really high dissolved phosphorus content is a product of some things that have gone on in the watershed the last several decades to even generation or so, or if it's largely due to just native inherent soil properties and soil phosphorus contents that are natural, and then also the chemistry of that soil and its tendency to let go of that phosphorus and lose it to the stream and eventually to the lake. And Greg's going to get into that also when we get into some of the discussion later. The other thing we learned is that, and I think this was already mentioned, we have to control both the internal load, that cycle that I showed, as well as the external load if you want to maintain what we would view as acceptable water quality during your primary recreation season, the summer months, June, July, and August in particular. And so to control that internal load, that's a key component of this project going forward, and we want to make sure we come up with the best and most efficient and effective, cost-effective way to do that, and there's a little bit more information that we need to answer that question, and so we want to talk about that. One of those options might include some dredging, depending on phosphorus contents of some of those deeper sediments that we don't have information for. So we're going to present three scenarios really as to, here's three scenarios we looked at as to how can we get to that acceptable water quality. And we're kind of, we took a shot here saying this is what kind of we feel is acceptable, but that's ultimately going to be up to you folks, so we want to talk about that as well. But the key here is to look at, and I'm sorry, the blue lines here represent your distribution of annual rainfall, and these are months. So most of your rain falls in April, May, June. And with that comes in most of the flow and most of the external loading of phosphorus. On the other hand, the peak recreation months are really May, June, July, August, and then it tapers off towards the year. So here's when you really want good water quality, and that's represented by that green line. We'd like to, if we could only get acceptable water quality for 4 or 5 months of the year, we want to target those months that people are using the lake the most.
And when algae is tending to grow the most.
Right. And then, Sarah, did you want to talk about the cost and how that's reflected in those?
I think as we go through the scenarios, you'll see each scenario could have a different cost driving it that would be associated with that orange line, the management of the lake. And so I think we'll try to touch on that as we go through.
I think the visual, and the intent of the visual is to kind of explain our strategies here, is that it's gonna, the orange line that has the hump there, obviously with the larger precipitation month, that's just a trend line to show you it costs the most to treat the lake, when the most of the nutrients are coming in, obviously. It's obvious, but when we look at all these together, then it gets tricky, and something that's interesting there is that even though the precipitation, after June, the June is the largest one here, even as you get into July and August, the delivery to the lake is not the same as June. You got hotter weather that's gonna evaporate things, you got crops out there that are sucking up moisture from the rain, et cetera. So the delivery to the lake actually in those is not representative of the precipitation. And so we got that big flusher. So the critical path is really here. We got this big flush of nutrients coming in down from the watershed right before you wanna use the lake. And it's that timing that is going to ultimately drive the cost of the solution. Because as Charles pointed out, or Sarah pointed out there, we want to get the lake in good shape, especially in those summer months, right? We can live with a little pea green in November, right? That's a lot different than the 4th of July, right? That makes sense, everybody? So these are not actual numbers. This is more just kind of an explanation of strategy of how we got into our information and information you're going to see moving forward. This is just kind of a representation of how we develop the strategy for moving forward, so.
I think, Sarah, this is.
So basically, here, I'll go run through the 3 scenarios we developed. We broke our management alternatives into watershed, near the lake, and in the lake. If you read through the TM, you looked at all those alternatives. And so we tried to develop a scenario that really put an emphasis on one of the 3. 3 really does the best job at addressing that internal load. So the 1 and 2 scenarios are ultimately going to have to be paired with an option that also addresses the internal load. So scenario 1 and 2 are focusing on the watershed. How are we going to control that flush that we have coming in the spring? And the watershed based, this is highly hypothetical. I developed that model that sort of gave us a nice representation of the loads coming from cropland, the loads coming from pasture land, the loads coming from stream bank erosion. So what are some typical practices that we use that we could apply to get this 50% watershed reduction? 50% has been a number that's been used frequently in those 1997 feasibility study. A lot of the 319 work funds have been going towards that goal. So we sort of wanted to show what would it actually take, how much effort would it take in the watershed to get there. And like we said, the removal efficiencies that are traditionally applied with some of these practices, when they're sediment-attached phosphorus, they're aimed at targeting the sediment-attached phosphorus. Those removal efficiencies are higher when you have that component to try to trap and treat the sediment and remove it from the system. When the phosphorus is in this dissolved component and those alternatives that you're using to reduce erosion and trap sediment, such as terraces, such as wet retention ponds, trying to trap and treat and remove that sediment-attached portion. Those trapping efficiencies, they don't work near as well in this watershed because you have that dissolved component that those practices aren't able to treat. So by the time we get down to the quantity of these practices that we need in the watershed to make a really large dent, 50%, we started having, it's not very realistic, but ultimately, maybe it provides some good perspective at about an $87 million to be poured into that watershed over the next, who knows how many years it would take. It's not, we'll make some simulations if you want to.
Yeah, I think I just want to add to that just a little. When Sarah says not realistic, it's realistic, but probably not feasible or cost effective, I think is.
Yeah, maybe that's more
you could
theoretically. I just made it up.
Yeah, that was a good question. I have a lot of questions on my table, but what I'd like to ask you to answer now is, what did you base those numbers on?
Which ones?
The reductions?
Efficiency or the
Any of those?
Go ahead, sir.
So for like the percent of the area treated,
Sure, that and removal efficiency.
well, removal efficiency, we tried to base it on literature, but modify it for the dissolved component, realizing that oftentimes you get better efficiencies, from some of these practices, but they had to be reduced because of the dissolved component that's in the watershed.
So generally accepted rules of thumb from sources such as NRCS, USDA, NRCS, state nutrient reduction efforts in surrounding states, things of that nature.
And I
So
don't-
those are not made up values. Those are the best data that we have in the scientific and engineering community for those kinds of practices.
And basically, I had to come up with I came up with a hypothetical scenario until I could get a 50% reduction from the watershed.
The other thing, Sarah, maybe we should point out is the removal efficiency of the practice is really the second to the right column. The actual efficiency on the watershed basis is the far right column, which are very low, and that's just because you cannot treat the whole watershed. So that's why those numbers are so small.
I mean, I can provide the actual calculations that went into the back end of that, but the percent area treated is a hypothetical of what if we treated 70% of the watershed with cover crop. These are the load reductions that our model predicts.
Just trying to get to that 50% reduction.
And I don't want to say that they're not worth it. I mean, I don't want to come out of here saying we don't want to be doing ag conservation practices, because I think we'll come back full circle and saying anything we can be doing to reduce the watershed load will help your annual maintenance costs. Anything you have to do on an annual basis, anything you can be doing in the watershed to reduce concentration or loads will help.
So the modeling now that we wanted to confirm, okay, in this scenario where we were able to grab 50% of the phosphorus coming down Firesteel Creek and keeping it up there in the watershed, we wanted to see what that would look like in terms of water quality in the lake, because that's really the ultimate thing that everyone cares about, right? And so what you see here in the red is that's our baseline condition. This is 2001 through 2014 year end. And that red line is what we saw at that time. And that's a simulated output, but it's based on the observed data we had. I showed you how that was calibrated. So that's a pretty good representation of what we saw historically based on data combined with our model. If we got that 50% reduction that Sarah just described using those watershed practices only, you see a dashed green line there that in many cases overlaps with the baseline, but in some cases there does provide some reduction. We're cutting off some of those peaks when the external load was really high, and we're seeing a lot of that high flow phosphorus coming through. It does reduce those peak phosphorus loads and therefore concentrations in the lake. I think I'm going to go ahead and say this now. Obviously, that's not acceptable water quality. We're still up in that 400 range much of the time. So we did go ahead, and we'll get into the details of this later. We're jumping ahead just a bit, but in order to do something with that, we said, well, okay, what if we were able to really control that internal load that we've described? That's the blue line here. And you can see in that case, that internal control began right there in June of 2003, just for simulation purposes. You can see that really drops things significantly. We still jump up here, a couple of hundred parts per billion, when we have high external loads. That's really essentially an indicator of flows coming in from Firesteel. The internal load control doesn't help that. But times of the year where we're not getting that external load, we're down there closer to where we want to be if we combine that 50% watershed reduction with complete or near complete control of that internal load. So that's scenario one.
I've got a question on that. So you're saying that you can reduce the phosphorus coming from the watershed by 50%?
We're not saying that.
No. If you could.
Yep.
It would only reduce the phosphorus in the lake by 1%.
At times that's correct. Because at times the phosphorus in the lake, there's times when you have no flow from the watershed, and we still see high phosphorus concentrations in the lake.
Right, because of the existing load.
Because of the internal. I think I see where your struggle with this is coming. That internal load is only present because of what has happened in the past and come into the lake from the watershed.
Right.
But we can't change that now. That's already there. So I know Greg is chomping at the bit here to jump in a little bit. So,
But it also has been, I think, established by you folks that one of the mechanisms of getting phosphorus out of the lake, existing internal load, is the water that carries it over the spillway.
That is a pathway, sure, that is a mechanism by which phosphorus leaves the lake.
Okay. I didn't read anything in your document about that.
But
It
that's-
seems like you're very focused on these near lake and in lake solutions, but there was nothing mentioned about how much phosphorus could be removed from the lake simply by dilution and outflow over the spillway.
That's reflected in everything you see here. That's just a part of how the lake functions. I think we should come back to that at the end. That's a pretty, if you want to dissect that further, we're happy to do that. We don't want to get too stuck on that right now. I can see your concerns. Greg, I want to give you an opportunity to say what you're thinking there.
Sure. And I want to give really a simplistic example of how the internal loading works by just using what most folks would understand if you've ever gargled with salt water, right? If I were to take my bottle here and fill it with salt, about yay high, right? I would have salt water all the way through the column, right? And I could gargle with that, hopefully cure my sore throat. If I finished that water and put fresh water on top of that, if I still had salt down in the bottom, would I have fresh water in here or salt water? I'd have salt water, right? And that's how internal loading works. We can clean up the external loading, but if we do nothing about the internal loading, the phosphates that are attached to particulates in the bed and also probably dissolved as precipitates are going to free up when we clean the upper water, and they'll release. So there really is no solution that doesn't involve both a combination of addressing external loading and addressing internal loads. Because if we only address external loads, the internal loads will overcome that and replace the phosphorus that was that we work so hard to remove.
I would challenge that by saying if you take your cup there that's full of salt and stick it under the water faucet and let it run for 5 minutes,
You bet.
that salt will be gone.
It will be gone. If we had a fresh lake system like in 1928, right, where we didn't have 90 years of stored phosphorus down in the sediments, you're absolutely right. If we had a fresh surface on that bottom.
I'm not saying we need to start with a fresh surface. I'm saying let's say we could magically fix the watershed and there weren't any phosphorus coming down the watershed anymore.
Mhm.
All that fresh water, your own data shows that the lake refills 3 times a year. That's a lot of flushing action. How long would it take for
In
the
time, and
phosphorus loads to go down?
it took 90 years at anywhere from 400 to 900 parts per million phosphorus to accumulate the tens of thousands of tons of phosphorus that are in that lake bed, and it would take generations for that to bleed back out.
Is that what your model shows?
I'll refer to Charles
Yes,
on the model,
absolutely.
but that's what it.
Yeah.
I didn't see that in the report.
There's a lot of scenarios that are feasible and don't make any sense, and just the chance of, I mean, it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of time on what if, what if we had clear water coming in, what would it take to flush it, because it's just not feasible.
I strongly disagree, wholeheartedly disagree
So
with
what
that.
we're showing is that even if we spend $100 million in the watershed and got to the point where we had a 50% reduction, it still doesn't make an impact, so why bother with 100?
Well,
That's what we're
I
getting
can tell you why, and I'm holding back my questions till later, but I would question many aspects of that chart that suggested it would cost $87 million. Many aspects.
Oh, and I'm happy to refine it based off of local knowledge. I mean, happy to do that, and apply maybe some efficiencies you've seen in the area. This was our first cut at it. We have not had technical feedback. I've contacted NRCS several times. Is Jeff here?
No,
I don't see him.
Okay. I mean, you can ask him how many times I've called to get a feel for what practices are going on in the watershed. How frequently do you see that? I tried, but I mean, there's limits to what I was capable of doing. So I wouldn't mind getting your feedback on what you think would be feasible.
With that too, the purpose of this was to begin dialing down on some high-level planning guesstimates. What are we talking about here? When we started this, we talked about, we don't know if we have a $20 or $200 million problem. That's one of the things we kind of talked about from the start. And by no means is anything in here perfect. And we can question, you can go and pick apart any particular number here, and there's going to be a range of uncertainty in what the effectiveness and the cost of that solution is. And you've obviously got a lot of experience with, studying the nutrient removal effectiveness of wetlands, et cetera. And so you may not care for that particular number. But what's important here is to make the case that, as Charles said a couple times, that we can't just focus on the watershed as a method of cleaning up the lake, because it's not practical because of the internal loading characteristics. And that's where those three, there's not 3 scenarios, there's 300 of different combinations of alternatives that could collectively help us get to a goal. And ultimately, the job is to refine our approach not only from a technical, but from a sociological aspect of what is acceptable here and what's even feasible based upon how much could Ducks Unlimited, how much could NRCS participate, and what kind of progress could we make in the next decade or something like that. Because we're obviously not dealing with something where we're going to fix this with wetlands next year. This is like I think Greg said, a generational issue.
Well, and I
So,
just want to say I respectfully disagree with your assessment.
that's fine.
Maybe if I could add one thing, because I've practiced in Minnesota for about 15 years, and I've seen time and time again where improvements to the watershed made dramatic improvements to lake quality, right? And I had some of these same misgivings, scratching my head, why can't this lake be radically improved just with watershed improvements? And it can be, but the time scale might not be what, it might not meet community goals. But your feelings are feelings that I've also had about this until I really looked at the levels of phosphorus that are in that lake bed. If we didn't have those extreme levels of phosphorus, and we're, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 parts per million, that's an order of magnitude what you see in most other lakes that have had successful programs with watershed management. So I have felt exactly what you're feeling.
I think your book said there's something like 70,000 pounds of phosphorus in the internal loading right now. Is that right?
That's an estimate based on a historical period of yes, of
Okay.
10-year period.
And I believe your assessment stated there were 87,000 pounds of phosphorus coming into the lake on an annual basis.
Roughly, that's about correct, right?
So there's more coming in on an annual basis than exists in the lake at the
But
present
the response of the lake is not linear.
Right.
It's not a linear response.
I understand.
So
I just want to.
Those were both annual numbers, both on an annual basis, so about 50/50.
I'm
74, 87.
yeah.
One is phosphorus that's there every year. I mean, it's there. The phosphorus you count today is the same phosphorus.
No,
you
that's the
count
rate at which it's being released. Every year, that load is being introduced into, so it's,
There's more than that than in the bottom of the lake?
yeah.
Much more.
Yes.
Much.
Yes, that's a release rate.
Happy to visit with you more about this at the end. As much time as you need. One more thing before we move on to the next scenario. I do want to point out, we showed the chart where the recreation season, with that heavy recreation use. So rather than just kind of blanket saying we want to get down to X, we want to get down to some magical concentration, it's really important also to look at how long is that concentration exceeded, or how long is that concentration attained. So with this scenario, you can see the baseline condition, and we used the same target that was utilized in the 2002 study by Osgood and Nuremberg, and that's not necessarily the right answer. We may want to revise that based on some of your feedback, but we used 90 parts per billion, 90 micrograms per liter if you prefer that. And so with this scenario, this baseline condition, we do nothing. What happened in the past, we're only under that 1% of the time. We're only under 90 parts per billion 1% of the time from June 1 to the end of August. With this scenario, if we did the 50% watershed improvements alone, we're not making much gains on that inside the recreation season. Again, a lot of this has to do with timing. And if we combine that 50% watershed with an internal inactivation or internal control method,
Your blue line.
the blue line, thank you, Sarah, we can get there about 31% of the time.
I think that
For
does
this
show
scenario.
that the watershed improvements would have a good reduction, a good benefit to the lake if we could get that internal load under control. Watershed reductions would get us at that low level.
Absolutely. If we're going to go ahead and describe the next scenario, I'm going to let Sarah and Mike kind of tag team this a little bit.
So if any of you have questions on how this all really follows through, feel free to ask me. I don't want you to feel lost, but transitioning to something that the city might have more control over. A system that, you know, if you guys really wanted to come in and put forth your own effort on something by the lake, that we could control how much actually reaches the lake. The point of the near lake scenario, pairing it with an internal control, as we said, has to happen. But
a little closer to the microphone?
oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. The point of this is actually that huge watershed we have, we're going to try to reduce the volume of that water that actually makes it to the lake. We might be able to control that. Well, I don't want to say we might. We found a way to control the volume of water, hence the pollutant load carried along with it, from entering the lake, replacing that water, and filling it with poor water quality. As we said earlier, the levels in Fire Seal Creek, as they stand now, are around 500 on an average basis. And when our goal is to be less than 100, the amount of that 500 level water feeding the lake, by reducing that, we can actually see some benefits to the lake, how the lake responds. And Charles will show you the actual results of this system once I'm through walking you through how it would work. So basically, it's a combination of a bypass system near the lake that would pull the water up a little bit before it enters, drain it through an open channel canal, and then literally pipe it through the lake in a pipe. I mean, so it's not actually entering the lake, but the pipe would enter, flow through the lake and out the other side of the dam. So never actually mixing with the water in the lake. So this bypass system is a combination of an earth excavated canal. If you can see, here's our elevation chart represented in the colors. Along the railroad track, we actually have a low, sort of a pathway that could gravity flow. If we just elevate the water a little bit, right upstream of the railroad tracks, we could get gravity flow. One idea was to pipe it all the way through the lake. Start up here. What happens if we put a pipe all the way through? Well, more expense. So by gravity flow, we can actually reduce the amount of pipe length that we have. So that we actually were pretty excited when we found this little low channel, open channel potential right along the railroad track. But that ends once you get to this bypass with this trib, and that's where we would have our pipe take over.
What's the projected cost of that?
I think we get there.
I can skip forward to that.
It's coming.
I'll summarize it all at the end. Yep. One other thing I do want to point out, we are letting low flows to the lake. The last thing we want to do is, drop your water level and not maintain the water level in your lake. So we are passing low flows to the lake. And the volume that we pass through, we would prefer to be treated with alum injection. And that is, I mean, if you guys have been involved and kept up with the alum, the whole lake alum treatments, it's the same principle. Alum binds to the phosphorus, makes it no longer available for algae growth. So this would just be applying it in a different method, injecting it into the pipe before it reaches the lake.
I'm going to take 2 steps. Go ahead, Mark.
I just had one quick question on this area right here. I think this is for the railroad bridge.
Yes.
Or the new bike bridge there. That's mostly dry all the way up to there. Do you have to have a pipe?
No, I mean, a lot of details to work out, Mark, and in fact, I hesitate to put these things on a map. The reason that we did show it here, and this could be moved further up in the watershed, there's lots of different ways you can tweak this scenario. I hesitate to put things on a map because then people start saying, hey, that's my land. No one's committing to anything here, but if you don't sometimes put it on a map, it's hard to understand the scale of what we're talking about. But I want to,
Could be some efficiencies yet.
oh, there's a ton. I mean, this was really just very conceptual, Mark, in terms of, I'm going to back up 2 steps and talk a little bit, some of the theory behind how we developed this.
Yeah.
And so when we look at, and this is one of the reasons we've really been scrambling the last couple of weeks. There was a huge error, a decimal place on USGS's website, and it caused a lot of frustrations and a lot of work we did in terms of sizing some things that we found the error in later. And so that was good news for the project when we found that error. But so the thought here is that, okay, again, we've got water coming down the channel. We've got a lot of water coming down the channel in April, May, and June. High concentration of phosphorus in that water. How do we keep it out of the channel? We made the joke early on in this project about, well, maybe if we just, let's just ship this all around the lake. And that kind of silly kind of scenario we were throwing out there started to become part of a reality. Because in essence there, anything we can change to change, the quality of the water coming in is going to be a big benefit. We started with looking at, how much detention would we need in the watershed? And the problem is that you get that detention, if the water doesn't go away, it eventually makes its way to the lake. So how do we control it and slowly meter it out, or treat it if water's needed at the time to either A, dilute the water in the lake to bring down concentrations, or B, help keep the lake full during the recreation season. So the closer it is to the lake, the better it is. And so these volumes and where this is shown, et cetera, certainly isn't intended to be any detailed design. This is just showing it from a high-level engineering aspect. It can work. So that's really the thought, is how could we detain some of that water so that we can control better when, how, and at what concentration it enters the lake. And so that's kind of the basis behind.
You're going to still have to treat or infuse part of the water that you do let into the lake. It's such a huge cost to divert it. Would it be possible just to infuse all the water coming into the lake and do it that way, or will it be addressed later on?
So there's several parts here. You're right. We couldn't possibly bypass all of it during peak floods, those kinds of things. So we're actually doing several things. We're storing. We're passing through some controlled flows at all times if the Firestill Creek is flowing, and then we're bypassing a range of flows from what we would consider kind of a runoff event, but a smaller one, up to some point. And those would be bypassed. Some of that, beyond that point, we couldn't bypass. So the lake would still take some of that high flow water in. But it's that part that we would have control over on up to kind of an average runoff event that could potentially be improved either through an injection system or possibly by things done during the design of that upland storage, that detention area. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be alum injection, but that would be a way of cleaning up that water for release to the lake, and particularly if we could control when that's released to the lake to try to keep the volume issue.
I guess my question though was, why couldn't you just alum inject?
The whole thing?
Well, your annual costs, I mean, really this is aimed at, let's reduce the annual costs because those could get out of hand every year. The volume of alum you would need to treat all of that water coming in would be very, very high. We can cost that out for you.
Even the feasibility of, when you have a flood, a flash flood.
Less expensive to do it this way than to infuse all the water.
And just more feasible.
After a period of time.
Right.
Yeah, because you got some, that's always it's the investment in this is a sustainable part of the solution. Strict alum injection and strict whole lake alum applications, that's not a sustainable solution. You're in a reactionary mode every single year. And some years it's going to cost you less than others. But our goal, for this was to find how can we inject some part of a sustainable solution along with watershed practices, which is also a sustainable solution because it's heading off nutrient at the source. But at what level does it make sense? And so what we kind of did is we started out at, what if it was 1,000 acre feet, 2,000 acre feet, 3, and this current is about 10,000 acre feet, which is, more than the storage of Lake Mitchell as it exists today. So you're talking about building and setting aside ground that's equivalent to the size, a little bit larger actually, than the existing Lake Mitchell, which is over 8,000 acre feet, but not 9. So we kept on toying with that because the bigger the basin is, the more of that runoff we can control, and the less of it that gets spilled over at those higher concentrations. We build this and we get a 1 inch, 2 inch rain, we might be able to control it all depending on the intensity of the rain, antecedent moisture conditions, et cetera. But the cost of that versus, you know, and so now we're gonna get maybe 2, maybe 3 on average rain events would overtop that a year. We make it 20,000 acre feet, maybe it's 1, you know, just in statistically. But you get to the point where there's a law of diminishing returns and it doesn't make sense to make that investment. There's some work left to do on fine tuning what that is and how much of it really makes sense. And we're gonna talk about some of the things that are being needed to get to that later, but that's kind of where this is now. And so I don't want anybody to think that this is necessarily the only place for the solution. We wanted to get something on the map to show scale. And just at one portion to say it's engineeringly feasible to do the project right there. Obviously, the further we go back up, the more we gotta rely on the existing channel, diverting out of the existing channel, et cetera, but still possible too.
20 years ago or so, we tried massive alum treatments, and they didn't work then. Why would it work now?
You're about 3 slides ahead of us every time.
Okay.
This is a good student. We are gonna get to that, sir.
But isn't that the point of this, is to create a stable situation so you can treat the lake? You know,
Absolutely.
I guess, looking at your data, looking in the watershed, the different sub-watersheds, the highest load was 0.23 to 0.26 pounds per year per acre, I believe. And you said typically problematic watersheds are 3 to 4 pounds per acre per year. This is 0.23. So you don't have any one spot in the watershed that's unloading all of this. So you're not gonna go up there and say, aha, here's our problem, we're gonna fix this.
We don't know that for absolute certain, Joe, and the reason we don't know that is that we're basing this off of GIS-based land management practices that, you know, in that STEPL model.
Okay.
And so one of the things that we are proposing is that we go and we kind of tie that down to make sure that isn't the case, that there isn't more. So I'm not arguing anything about what you said about the reduction in terms of the land practices, but there still could be some smoking guns in the watershed.
Yeah, but the point being, it's the volume of water that's coming down that's affecting our lake. And, you know, it's not a specific source, but it's that huge volume over that large area that our lake is capturing. And that's what makes it a problem. So until you do something about the volume of water going into the lake, I don't think you can get to a point where you can treat it.
Yeah, well, and Greg's gonna hit on that a little bit more, but you're probably 90% right, Joe.
I'm just gonna regurgitate this so I make sure I understand it. We're looking at a holding pond.
Yeah, dry
It's
detention.
gonna catch the water, right?
Yes, sir.
And then we're gonna say, you know, when it's really coming down hard and fast, out of a big storm, it's probably picking up a lot of phosphorus. So we're gonna wanna keep that. We're gonna just kind of pile it up in here. And then when it's just normally flowing, that really doesn't carry a whole lot of phosphorus. We can let it flow in, and we can put some alum in it, and we can kind of clean that stuff up.
You're saying it
And
better
this
than I
other
did.
stuff, we're just kind of gonna let it seep out and put it on the other side of the spillway. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, I have some concerns about using the alum because, again, our lake has pH of 8, and alum treatment is better at a lower pH, plus it has that light flock. Our lake isn't that deep, and if you're running boats through that, it's just gonna bring it up, it's just gonna put it right back into the water.
Another good student in the class here, so Greg's gonna get into that a little bit. It's redistributing alum off the bottom of the lake is actually a good thing sometimes, because then it could further strip alum out of or phosphorus out of the water column. We wrote a lot of this report talking about alum, and at the very end, we started changing it to phosphorus inactivation. And some of the concerns you already brought up with regards to pH and other toxicology, that's literally the next segment here, is Greg's gonna get into some of those details about that.
Alum is a way, it's not the way, so like I said, we get into that internal discussion, we're gonna really drill into that issue.
So just a comment, I mean, I know we're here to talk about Lake Mitchell, but, you know, with that solution there, we're basically saying we're gonna take all this water with all these excess nutrients and we're gonna dump it in the James River and let somebody downstream worry about it.
Actually,
It's happening anyway.
So we shouldn't worry about it?
no.
I didn't say we shouldn't worry
No,
about it, it's
I
happening
agree
anyway.
that
That's
this,
what's going right now, is just flushing through the lake.
I agree that this lacks a conservation component, and that was my least favorite part about it. But after, I was like, well, are we gonna get any of the conservation funding, any of those things for such things like this? But think about the water, the concentrations coming through Firestill Creek are, 500s. In the lake, they're receiving that new internal load, and they're increasing, and they're getting worse water in the lake. So you're actually making things better. By bypassing that water, the water it's getting downstream does not have that additive internal loading added to it.
Right. One of the things I think is important to point out with this impoundment is it actually traps a tremendous amount of phosphorus. So it would be something that would have to be periodically harvested, but you're trapping a tremendous amount of phosphorus in that impoundment because it allows
In the dry one, are you
in the
talking
dry impoundment, right?
I thought you said most of it was dissolved phosphorus, not sediment-bound phosphorus.
Yep.
But if it's 2/3 dissolved and 1/3 sediment attached, 1/3's a lot.
Right.
Anything we're talking about with that kind of scale, of any kind of management strategy, 1/3 is a lot. And it's not even 100% of the third. But this is gonna be a lot of, there's no silver bullet here. It's gonna be a lot of things to have to work collectively as a system and a dynamic system to add up. So it's one other way of helping.
But if just by way of example, if you could take 800 parts per million coming in and put 650 down on the other side of the creek, I think you've accomplished something not just for this lake, but for the entire watershed.
How many acres is that big impoundment that you're suggesting?
So what we've just basically said is that if it's 10,000 acre feet, and it's an average of, if it's 10 feet deep, that's 1,000 surface acres.
It was about 740, but
How
But
many, and basically it's a big
concept.
wetland.
It's dry.
Well, it could be, this is right now, we're planning for dry detention to maximize how much of the volume of the runoff we could shave off. So right now it's planned for dry detention. There would be some vegetation management strategy in there, but
It would be very wet periodically.
Yeah.
It just wouldn't be, it wouldn't have a continuous pool. It would not have a continuous pool of
Say
water.
1,000 acres?
if it was 10 feet deep, and we focus on volume right now, not so much surface area, because the depth of it's gonna be a function of where ultimately it would go. But if it was 10,000 acre feet at 10 feet deep average, it would be,
Just curious what your analysis showed for how many acres of drained wetlands there are in the watershed.
drained. How many wetlands have already begun? We didn't just go in and study, past land use and how that may have affected current loading. That would take a pretty big effort. You probably have a pretty good idea though.
I don't have a number,
Oh.
but
You could
it would
find
be
out.
very important.
What's that?
I would think it would be very important.
It would be interesting to know how it may have affected past things, but it doesn't change where we're starting from today.
Well, sure it does.
It does.
Again, the issue is, we're talking about very low per acre yields already coming off the watershed, but when it does come, it comes typically at really high flows. And so, again, that's one of the advantages you see in a strategy like this, which can help address some of those issues and the timing. It's really, again, all about timing.
There are a lot of other things that have to go along with this. There's dam safety issues. If you located it right there, you'd be within the existing flood pool of Lake Mitchell, so you'd have to mitigate that. So there's a lot of other things that have to go into this. But again, the purpose was to say, what's just 3 points on the wall here of watershed-based, near lake, in lake, and so this is the near lake.
And one of my preferences, it's not on here because we couldn't hang our hat on it as, what's gonna treat those low flows. We put alum injection on there but personally what I think would be a great addition would be, let's let the large retention pond drain into a huge wetland. What if we create a huge wetland complex and let that, since the flows are attenuated upstream, have a controlled environment where it could be receiving low flows, and maybe we could get large-scale phosphorus reductions from a wetland, then enter a bypass system.
It's more land, it's more cost.
It's more land, it's more cost, but it has some conservation. It could potentially reduce your alum injection costs down the road. So I think that's something we can pursue if that's the interest of the city.
Would a dam alone help at all? Without the injections? Does it settle?
But it does. There's going to be some natural, just like it's basically, it becomes the new upstream Lake Mitchell. And so everything that it traps there as far as sediment, and natural processes that do help with some, just part of the dissolved part. But once it's full, it essentially comes a little bit of a pass through there.
But if you have the dam and
The
the.
bypass?
And the bypass, right, so that's really what we're
That's-
talking
that
about,
is-
is that
yeah.
diversion being a
But
small
without
down.
without the treatment.
Yes, possibly. There's a benefit to the alum injection. There would be a benefit without the alum injection as well. It just wouldn't be as significant.
Given the fact that we have 3 times a year where massive amounts of water and sediment are coming into the lake, don't we have to take care of our homework upstream before we do the alum applications for those 3 times a year that are coat the top of that alum treatment?
Yeah.
We're hoping to hold those 3 events back. I mean, that's
Well, there's
with
times
the
where
retention.
that
There will be time.
sedimentation dams are gonna be able to hold
All
that water.
3 at one time.
Our soils are naturally extremely high in phosphorus.
That's
lot
what
of
we-
phosphorus.
yeah.
And 2, any phosphorus application by farmers or whoever, homeowners, is quickly locked up in the soil within days or weeks. And it stays there unless an event precipitates its movement, which is erosion. We've got miles of cut banks up there that are just bare dirt, and any small amount of rain will wash that in, and there's probably in July and August, when we get those rains, where that phosphorus is moving into the lake.
Everything you said, we agree with 100%. And so we do need to keep moving in the watershed. We know, as a fact, 2 things. Number one, that the work in the watershed has been slow. We hope that the results of this and a renewed interest in the watershed help to speed things up. But one thing's for certain is that if we rely on the rate of progress that's been made in the past, I mean, we just have to all in this room be, comfortable with the fact that you're never going to see a change in Lake Mitchell in your lifetime. It's not going to happen.
I love the concept of settling basins and draft waterways to
Right.
stop this erosion, and I think those are points that would be easily saleable to the farm community and residents.
And I agree with you, and that's one of those things, that watershed coordinator position would really be of benefit, is to help not only identify those areas and work on not only farming practices, but some of the wetland areas I know that Steve's interested in as well, and be able to go through, and we've pushed and said, watershed only application here is just, it's never gonna amount to what you need it to. But effort should continue, absolutely, because everything you do in the watershed maintains that annual O&M, or that the rate at which you're falling behind again, if you're doing nothing. And so I think we agree 100% with everything you just said there. That timing of those, this is what that was intended to show too, is that you talked about the timings of things, and if we knew one of the things we said is if we knew exactly when it was gonna quit raining every year, we could go in with a very low level alum dose, just strip the water column so you all can enjoy your lake for the, June, July, and August, and then let it go to heck the rest of the year. That's one management strategy that you could take. The problem is if you went out and spent $350,000 stripping a water column and you got a 2-inch rain the next day, you're gonna be angry. And someone's gonna shoot me. And so, as by itself, it's just a very risky strategy. So, incorporating those sustainable practices, are really this harder, is the watershed work and these harder engineering practices that can supplement some of those more reactionary practices, I would call, which is the neutralization of the phosphorus.
Do you have any readings on the phosphorus load up the FYRA Creek, say from the west end at 0, and then mile 1, mile 2, mile 3, mile 4, and did you find any hot spots along the way?
Another great student. We do have limited data right now. Charles can tell you what it is, but that's one of the things we're proposing to do.
Yep. Yeah, that's good. The vast majority of the data we do have historically is in that lower reach of Firesteel Creek. We have a random grab sample here or there from past efforts, and it's just not enough to make any.
You don't know if there's a hotbed somewhere upstream?
That's correct. That's correct.
That's-
And like Mike said, we're gonna go into what that means and what we can do about it.
And it's expensive to find out, and that's part of what's proposed, is some next step.
I think we probably better
Yeah, let's
keep moving here.
Greater lights.
So we were gonna go into more detail here about how
Yeah,
this would work.
let's try to hustle through some of this real quick so we can get Greg up here and get done in at least leave half an hour. So some of what we're looking at here, so this is a picture of the spillway repair project. And so one of the things we did was just considered some of the things we could do there, dredging, mechanical versus hydraulic. Could we drain the lake? If we could drain the lake, we could, for one season, we could do, or one fall, we could do a lot of things. We could do mechanical dredging instead of hydraulic dredging and make sure we do a great job of getting those soft sediments out and get it back down to the hard pan. Greg's going to talk about that a little bit. You know, hypolimnetic injection, and so drawing water and soft sediments off the bottom of the lake in the future instead of everything spilling over the top is another strategy that we talked about that could happen there. And then also a low-level port to be able to come in and use vegetation management strategies to not only stabilize sediments in shallow areas, but also additional nutrient uptake within the lake in the shallow areas to help do that. So that's something else that we looked at and how all these things might work. It's tricky. You don't have a low-level drawdown now at the lake, and so that's one of those things that, you know, socially, is that something that you think would be acceptable to do that? Because you could kill a lot of birds with one stone if you did something like that within these projects. And if you did that bypass system, you can put it up and over the spillway, up and over the dam. Chances are you're going to have to use a pump to prime a siphon system or gain the capacity you need there. Here we could bypass, you could put it right down there through the bottom of the spillway and, you know, exit it out at the bottom of the apron there of the OG. So we did look at that. Just want to make sure that's more in the report than more that we're going to talk about tonight. But that's something we'd like some feedback on, I think.
So this next slide, really, we wanted to make sure and demonstrate what we thought everyone would have concerns about with this scenario 2 and this bypass. We recognize that water level is an issue at times of the year. So, but again, we're really talking about peeling off high flows. So this is the red line is water level simulations. You've already seen this plot, essentially. The blue dotted lines are, again, historical water level measurements. So we're just showing here that we're simulating that relatively well. With that bypass, you know, that storage, you know, pass through and bypass system in place, we're really only affecting water levels at those peak flow times. I'll go back and forth here a few times. This is now, or this was historical, and this would have been historical had that system been in place. So you can see we're not really drawing down volumes here, and that's because we're letting flow. Flow is going to come through that system most of the time into the lake. It's when it's barreling through there and carrying the highest amount of phosphorus that we're keeping it out. So we just wanted to kind of show that to maybe prevent some concerns that weren't valid right up at the front. So we just, again, wanted to show that. Now this is what water quality would look like with those systems. There's a lot to see here. I apologize again for the folks in the back of the room. Baseline, again, is shown in red. This is in-lake phosphorus concentrations, shown in red, historically speaking, that historical period. If we did nothing but the near-lake system, you see something similar to with that 50% watershed load reduction. You have some of the same issues. It's helpful at times, but it's not going to get us to the goal. So again, we had to combine it with control of that internal phosphorus source. That's the solid blue line where we're well under the goal most times after the internal control is activated there. With this approach, again, baseline, we're only meeting the goal about 1% of the time. With this system in place and we did nothing else, it's only 2%. And you're thinking, that's a lot of money for not a lot of gain. We would have to combine it again with internal control. Then we would be where we want to be about 70% of the time of that recreation season. And so, just to summarize that, I think maybe we should just keep moving. We've really spent a lot of time on this scenario. Do you want to go ahead and just get into the next and last scenario, Mike, or do you want to wrap this up?
Sure. Yeah,
I already
think
touched on
in
it.
order to leave some time, first of all, we'll be here as late as anybody wants to talk, but I understand there's an event in town, and so there'll be plenty of opportunity for feedback as well. But so this is just kind of a summary there. So moving into for that third point, since we've already said as part of even if we did great things in the watershed, we'd still need to control internal loading. Even if we did a highly engineered project near the lake, we'd still need to do something about internal loading to help meet goals that I think you're all collectively going to want to work towards. And so it seemed like the natural question was what if we don't do anything else except for just apply some kind of phosphorus inactivation? And so Charles can talk real briefly about how we modeled that, what that meant. There's a lot of work to do. Some of these I want to talk real quick about this cost before I get away from it, just so everybody hears this, including the paper. These are very planning level costs here. We use things like percentages just because we're aiming for something and we're comparing alternatives here. It's not very likely, unless we do something crazy, that you're gonna have $4 million in engineering costs to do this phase. 20% is just kind of a standard number you throw on things to make things consistent instead of looking at each individual project specifically and saying how much it's gonna be. We've also got a lot of money in contingencies here. So engineering contingencies right here is almost $8-9 million here. So now this 30 million, you know, with some design refinement, et cetera, we want to get that down a lot closer. Hopefully, I don't know why 20 million seems like it's a goal out there, but now that we've seen this cost, it looks like it's something that's certainly in the realm of possibility to get to. That $2 million project doesn't seem to be there. And so that's where we're working. So this next one really is just, what if you did, it's not definitely not what we're recommending, it's not a sustainable solution at all, but just for a price point on that line of comparison here, that's what we're looking at here,
So with the first two scenarios, you're probably thinking, why don't we just do internal load? That seems to be the problem. We're not seeing huge gains that we need with those watershed controls or the near lake system. So we wanted to see what an internal load control only would do. And so again, baseline conditions shown in red. If we did internal loading only, for a period of time, we dropped the concentration down quite a bit most of the time, but you still have peaks. Anytime you have a large runoff event, you're going to exceed that acceptable water quality. So with this scenario, internal load control only, you're only about, you're attaining that goal about 20% of the time. So a lot, but that's that 20% of the time that may or may not be acceptable within your and that's just within your recreation season, not within the entire
Charles, before you
year.
look at that slide, real quick, every time you see this, and we've shown these three different scenarios, what you look at is where that blue line doesn't sink down below the red
that's
line.
your goal.
You know, you look at it, 2010 and 2011, we know were very wet years. And so obviously that kind of tells us, even if we do a lot of these things, if we have one of those extremely wet years, there's still a risk that what we're planning for, because we're planning things based upon averages, we're still going to struggle when we have those really wet years to maintain the water quality. So that's, you'll see that consistent trend in all these graphs.
And that was part of the, someone had asked about those, that historical alum application. It turns out when those were done I think 2 of the 4, if not 3 of the 4 years, what Mike had said earlier is exactly what happened. That external load, there was a flood event, a large runoff event right after application. So it really shortened the effectiveness of those alum applications.
So really that bypass system and Near Lake project is really to protect, you know, once you achieve those good water quality in the lake, we want to keep that water in there. We want to protect that system. We don't want a big event coming through and washing that out. That was sort of the premise of scenario 2 and that Near Lake project is let's protect that investment we just made and this good water quality we achieved.
I think this is probably where we want to have Greg come in here, because for this screening level estimate, we were considering things like alum to get at that internal load. So some of the numbers you see here are even more so estimates because we tried to base them on that. But we're pretty sure that's probably not ultimately the best way to go, and so Greg's going to discuss that a little bit in more detail.
Greg, I think your speech will do it. I think your parking lot speech might be great for this, and I'd like you also address the question about the pH and also, you know, that buildup of time and a release and why this hypereutrophic lake and because of the age of it and the sediments is creates challenges for alum.
You bet. So I want everybody to feel free to just chime in at any point, because I'm going to try to be as simple as possible, but we can go as complex as anybody wants to. I want to give a couple of analogies for how phosphorus absorbs to lake beds and then gets subsequently released. And the simplest analogy is like a sponge, right? If we have dirty water and a clean sponge, the sponge is going to get dirtier, right? If we have clean water and a dirty sponge, the sponge is going to release materials out of the sponge and make the water dirty. And our lake behaves that way, right? If the water's dirty for 90 years and we started off with clean sediments, that's going to absorb as much as it can until it fills up and it's not able to absorb anymore. Well, limnologists get into partitioning how the sponge works and they divide things up into little compartments. And I like to use the analogy of an airport parking lot. If you go down to Sioux Falls to hop on a plane, there's a couple of options for where we put our cars, right? We can have the drive-through where we just drop off or pick people up, and that's a very fast exchange. And that's very much like just simple exchanges like you have on your water softener at home. It's very fast, very readily available to the lake, and that's something limnologists rely on pretty frequently. Then we have something that I liken to be kind of like the short-term parking, and that's ferric iron, like rust on a car. It's rust-colored iron 3, and that has an affinity for phosphorus, so phosphorus will bind onto that iron. But if we develop anoxic conditions in a lake, that rusty iron, iron 3, will get reduced down to an iron 2, which is what you see in wetland sediments. That's why wetland sediments are black. That's the iron 2, and that liberates a lot of the phosphorus in most lakes. And in a, say like a wood lake in Wisconsin or Minnesota where there's not a lot of phosphorus in the bed, it'll almost completely release the phosphorus. And then there's kind of a long-term parking where we're looking at really complex minerals like ferrous phosphates, calcium phosphates that are called apatite, which is the same thing that your bones are made out of. But there's a lot of different compositions, and some are more soluble and some are less soluble. We know that from dentistry, right? We have fluoride in our water because we know that fluoride makes those calcium apatites stronger. Well, the apatites that are in the lake are usually hydroxyl based. They have an OH group, and sometimes because there's a lot of microbes down there, they have carbonates on them, and they're weaker apatites. So they dissolve faster than, say, our bones or our teeth. In a lake like Mitchell, which has been accumulating sediments for a long time, if you can think of a scenario where this lake started off and we had an open parking lot. We had all the room in the short-term parking, all the room in the long-term parking, and as phosphorus came in, it could find a parking spot on those minerals. And instead of going into the water, it would pull into those chemical spots and get sequestered out of the water. Well, eventually in time, as phosphorus was coming in, it became harder and harder for that phosphorus to find a place to reside. And we know when we come to a ball game or a full parking lot at the airport or whatever it is, if you can't find a parking spot, you drive around until you do. And what's happening with the phosphorus in our lake is it's staying up in the lake because it's got no place to go until it spills over the spillway or it finds its way into an organism that makes your lake less attractive. So these are kind of the mechanisms, and when we develop the amount of phosphorus that's in Lake Mitchell, it doesn't behave the same way that a lot of lakes that form the bases of our study and literature behave. Most of the lakes that have been studied in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, they're oligotrophic, mesotrophic, so they don't have the severity of problems that we have. And they tend not to form these kind of ferrous phosphate precipitates. But I can almost guarantee you, without even doing any testing, that when a lake like this has levels year after year, decade after decade in the 300, 400, 800 level, that those ferrous phosphates are forming. Well, that becomes a problem because now it's a new reserve of phosphorus that's not typically contemplated in most limnological models. And we have to consider it when we're looking at things like alum addition or changes in pH or what would happen if we suddenly cleaned up the lake. So one of the things that happens if, I use that saltwater example, if we were to come in and dump lots of alum into the system, we would only get short-lived results, and I want to explain why there were short-lived results in the last alum applications. What will happen is if the water column gets clean and you've got a dirty sponge underneath, that sponge is going to release back to the water column. So we don't just have the ordinary types of loading parameters like the rust-bound phosphates and the easily exchangeable. We probably have precipitates that provide a long-term source. So it's cars coming out of long-term parking that are just going to come into the water if we suddenly clear it up. And that's why it's so important to be addressing both the internal load and the external load. The loading numbers that are in Charles's models are applicable to the type of scenario that we have currently in the water, right? If there's a lot of phosphorus in the water, those precipitates will stay as precipitates. And they have been actually improving the lake water quality for decades. It's probably why you enjoyed, from 1928 until the 70s, pretty decent water quality is because these things were ultimately precipitating and tying up a lot of phosphorus. But now it's just gotten to a point where there's just no room left for phosphorus. And that's something that tends to make dredging more attractive. The problem with some dredging, in some lakes, they shave off some of the bottom, right, to get increased depth or remove soft materials that might recirculate. In this kind of scenario, you wouldn't want to go part way. You'd want to make sure that you get all the way down to the original hard pan, because if you just dredge halfway, then the phosphorus that's underneath that layer is now readily available and will just come right back up, and everybody will feel hurt because the investment they put into dredging didn't work, right? And the same thing applies if you look at a scenario with a whole lake alum treatment, which is common for a lot of lakes, and it works for a lot of lakes. In this scenario, to do a whole lake alum treatment would probably end up being, for one, extraordinarily expensive because of the high levels of phosphorus, but it would get eaten up by these precipitates very, very quickly. So the other thing to consider, and you mentioned pH and acidity levels, the amount of alum that would be required to address these old phosphorus sediments underneath and get internal control through a whole alum treatment would require a tremendous amount of buffering chemicals in order to avoid a pH change. So that would be added on top of the expense of the simple alum treatments. The other thing it does is it may provide excessive sulfate. Sulfate is not our friend in this lake scenario. In some lakes it works for us, but in this lake, where you have most likely ferrous, the black iron, attaching to the phosphorus, if we put sulfate in the lower system, that can get reduced to sulfides, which is, it gives you that rotten egg smell. If you've ever stepped in a wetland or smelled something that rotted, that smell is hydrogen sulfide. Sulfate would get reduced to that, and when it does, it binds up the iron. If that iron too is bound up in a sulfide, it's not available now as a parking spot for phosphorus. And phosphorus that was previously bound to the ferrous would then get released. So we'd have to be very, very careful about how alum is applied. And in this lake, it's probably something that you want to look at as being a judicial thing, applied for short-term bursts for the purposes of maybe cleaning up a water column or a moderate flow coming out of an impoundment, but not as a whole lake approach. It would just be too expensive, and it might be very, very disappointing at the end of that.
Just briefly, so when you talk about dredging, and I know this is not an important thing, but you're not talking about draining the lake, you can dredge it, or does it have to be drained to be dredged?
Well, there's two options, and I think that becomes a community decision, and Mike can speak to this. It is a lot less expensive if you look at a whole lake solution and possibly look at bottom withdrawals, restoration of vegetation, and dry dredging, all of that at the same time. And the benefit you get out of draining the lake is you can get in there with yellow iron equipment and see the boundary between the lake sediments and the old hard pan, because you definitely want to get down to that boundary and get into the old hard pan to get all that phosphorus out of there. So cheaper to get the material out, more effective because you can actually observe it with your eyeball when you hit the original stuff. One other thing, because there's a lot of discussion about the watershed, I just want to address the mechanism of why we see these really high phosphorus loadings during gully washers and why they're a little bit lower when we don't have the high flows. As you pointed out, we've got a lot of natural phosphorus in this watershed. And whether we have phosphorus from natural sources or phosphorus from anthropogenic sources, that phosphorus binds to iron in the watershed just like it binds to iron in the lake. And what we have in our kind of flashy, in South Dakota, all the South Dakota streams that I've looked at, and I've lived here since 1972 for most of my life I've lived in South Dakota. What we see is a lot of volume in the spring, and that rain can leach out iron out of the soils, natural iron. And then when we have lower flow in the summers and falls, we see a seepage phase on our stream beds. Groundwater is seeping into the streams and feeding the streams. Even if you haven't had rain for a month, you can still see some of these streams flowing, and it's because groundwater is feeding them. Well, that black iron that's mobile in groundwater When it hits the stream bank, it turns into rust, iron 3. And that iron 3 will grab any phosphorus that it connects with. During low flow, that'll store the phosphorus. But when we get a gully washer, and it's going to coat the grains and it provides a long-term store. So in low flow, when that water's coming through and storing phosphorus, it enters the lake at lower levels. But in a gully washer, that'll come up, rip off that rusty part, grind the particles together in the stream bed and re-liberate it into the water column. So when we have the gully washers, that's why we're seeing these 700, 800, 900, close to 1,000 parts per million phosphorus, is because the gully washer is just grinding up everything that was stored during the low flow. So.
Can you touch on, is dredging the only way to treat the internal load?
It'd be real, with the amount of phosphorus that's been stored in this system, it'd be really tough to treat that with just alum. So it's a kind of a pickle, because if we lower the pH too much, the apatite can dissolve. If we raise it too much, the ferrous phosphates can dissolve. So
The dry bulk, I mean, would we do a dry bulk?
What's that?
Like an
You
aluminum
could,
hydroxide
it
or
would be a
calcium hydroxide?
tremendous, you could dry bulk it with aluminum hydroxide. It would be a tremendous amount. And I think that's something that we'd have to sit down and look at from a cost perspective as we look at design refinement, is what's it going to cost to do what? And I'm not prepared to stand up here right now and pin that down.
But I guess one of
Can
the
I ask a
things that-
question, please?
Yeah.
If I think I read somewhere in here at one point in this study that the watershed accounts for 35% of the problem. And so,
It's more, it's over 50, it's about 53%.
oh, 53%? I thought I read 35%, but anyway, we're going to do the bypass. And I think Steve asked that question about what's going to happen if we bypass the lake and dump that all into the Jim River, and what happens between Mitchell and Yankton on that. You said that isn't going to cause a problem, but how much is it going to reduce the amount of phosphorus if we do that bypass? And I mean, I didn't hear no percentages. Is it going to reduce that 50-some% that's coming into the lake by 20%, 10%, 50%?
We really wanted to focus on the in-lake water quality, so we showed the impact on the concentration. I could posit a guess on the load reduction off the top of my head, but I could be wrong because they don't have it memorized. But I want to say it's in the 30 to 35% range, because it would be bigger, but we're only able to do that for some allocation, certain allocation of the flow regime. So we're in that, and that may be, I don't believe that was in the report.
So 50% is coming from the watershed, and the other 50% is coming from internal.
Roughly.
In the internal, the only way to do that would be we would give it massive doses of alum in the summer months like June, July, and August. Is that what I'm hearing?
No.
Or a dredging project to get rid of those.
Or dredging,
To
but-
get the soft sediments out of
But
it.
I thought I heard alum was, I mean, I know it's very expensive, but if it's just a temporary fix and it's not a permanent fix, that the really only permanent fix, if I'm hearing this correctly, is dredging the lake?
So alum could be used as a great supplement later. If we got rid of those the problem-causing sediments on the bottom of the lake, alum could be a long-term management strategy tool that would be very effective. And in terms of removing phosphorus per pound, it's probably the least expensive of any of them by a factor of 10. It just has to be done in the right setting.
If we were to ever consider dredging, what kind of a dollar figure are we talking about?
So that's one of the things that, in terms of next step, Mayor Toomey, that we've been talking about is we need to get assessment. And one of the things we're proposing as the next step is to get an assessment on how much. One of the good news is that for a 90-plus year-old lake, the sedimentation hasn't been a big problem. And so, you dredged 550,000 cubic yards a while ago in the 80s or whatever. So that's one of the things we're proposing this winter, is to get a handle on what's the volume. And then talk about, when doing that, talk about the two different types.
Is spot dredging even an option?
Is what?
Spot dredging even an option?
It sure is, but we would have to think a little bit about, once we learned a little bit more about the nutrient content of the soft sediments, would it make sense to concentrate into certain parts of the lake? Or does it make sense to get it all, as Greg said, is probably a better idea. I think that's questions that get involved in that next step. So, yeah, Mark?
Speaking of that next step, and you might not have an answer for this today, but looking at the two different dredging techniques, kind of dry and wet options, is there the feasibility of doing kind of a little bit of both in that, I know one of the concerns of not draining the lake, but draining the lake is that you just lose all your water where the fish go, et cetera, et cetera. Would you, if that was something that would be done or wanted to be done, would you leave the water that would essentially be in the old creek bed? So if your fish would be going to that point, you still have depth there for that, and you can work on that, almost phase it, or then do the wet portion in the creek bed itself, if you will, the old creek canal area. Is that something that's feasible, or that you've seen, or that seems like potential that you'd be looking at in the next phase of things, or?
I think, Mark, you bring up a good idea, and so I would say, the simple answer to that might be, yeah, if we could save a lot of money by drawing down a lake 8 foot and leaving all the rest of the water in there, you could do that mechanically maybe and get into the coves and everything, and then worry about the deeper spots and do that hydraulically later. The better job we do of getting all of it, we're going to get better results. But then we got to think about the other things too. If we like the bypass system, if we like the idea of a hypolimnitic drawdown system, if we like the idea of a low-level drawdown to be able to do vegetation management on the shorelines, then we can achieve that and gain 22 foot of drawdown by modifying the spillway. So could we even take it another step and say do part hydraulic, part mechanical, modify the spillway using cofferdams the way they did the last time? I think all of those are on the table. I think once we understand the priorities of the community, and like you said, what I heard you saying is how can we protect this fishery? And then we have to ask ourselves, then also, what would it cost from a dollar standpoint and a time standpoint to reestablish the fishery if we decided that it was worth sacrificing the existing fishery to? So I think all those things would have to be answered.
And then just as a follow-up, your second option, that was the rough 31 million-ish. Did that include any of the in-lake work?
So that included, at that time, we were focusing more on alum to handle the internal loading. Okay. So all of the options included that internal loading addressment. Okay. So the question is it better used $6 million spent on alum, $6 million spent on dredging? Right. So there's definitely a cost component in there to handle the internal load. In the TM as it exists, that was dedicated towards alum. And this is really, all this data, all this stuff is coming in recent weeks, and a lot of work with Greg in the last 2 weeks where we're already modifying our position on a couple things. So I'm gonna hustle through here real quick. I think we're like almost at the last slide. So this is, so when we talk about what we want to do and so next steps. And so we want to keep progress moving on the project. I think in the coming year, there's a way to, when we're talking about doing things to this level, and we're talking about using kind of science and engineering based approaches to this, we want to do the best we can to get it right. You spend this kind of money you don't want to miss. And so it doesn't make sense to rush out and spend a bunch of money. There's a couple things that need to happen. Number one, data collection. And so the inflow hydrograph sampling, one of the things we'd like to know is when it does run off. You think about a water quality storm in a city, you always talk about that first half inch of capture. We want to get that first half inch of runoff because that's got all the bad stuff in it. The question is once we get into the watershed and understand better the source of the phosphorus, whether it is all soil-based or whether it's partially soil-based and there's some historical ag practices that are going on that could be addressed at more of those hot spots we talked about. Once we get an idea on that, we want to know in these flushes, how can we affect the volume of that detention system? Is it all coming in the first 20%? Is 80% of it coming in the first 20%, or is it just spread even? If there are spots in the typical runoffs where you got higher concentrations than others, then we can engineer a system to capture that portion of it and let some of the cleaner water go. And so that's one of the things we want to do is inflow hydrograph sampling. And the good news, not a lot of this is very expensive. The phosphorus sourcing in the watershed, again, where's the phosphorus coming from? When we're only getting at the bottom, we don't know the answer. So Art, we're going to give you a proposal to go through and get a better idea where that comes. The bathymetry, the soft sediments, once you got ice out in the lake, we can go out there and use a dual beam sonar to drill a couple holes, take some shots across the lake. Well, not a couple, probably a lot. And we can go down and we can map the soft sediments and get an idea of how much they are. I don't know if you're talking about 300,000 cubic yards or 2 million cubic yards right now. But we can get an idea of that pretty quickly, pretty inexpensively. Hard pan sediment ores. The one thing we did this last time when we took sediment cores is we just tested the soft sediments. But we didn't fractionate them the way Greg says we should to answer some of those questions about how deep, how many parking lots are we dealing with there and how full are the parking lots. So that's one thing we'll propose, as well as getting down to the hard pan to confirm that if we did remove soft sediments, those hard pans aren't going to be injecting as much phosphorus into the system there. And then land and livestock management, more detailed survey there with that as part of the next project to answer some of those questions. So in terms of that, what we're really proposing as far as the next phase, and that's in the TM, is the next phase being design refinement. How do we optimize the performance and the capacity for your dollars spent based upon the feedback that we'll get from this? And then how do we, alum injection, look at that, how might that work as a long-term management strategy? The last part I'll say is that in addition to that, typically you'd be hard pressed to find any project like this, papers on it, et cetera. If you look, almost every project we've done and most of the literature out there, in ag-based communities and ag-based watersheds, they're focusing on the watershed. And they're focusing on the watershed, and they're focusing on practices that trap sediments. And so, nutrient uptake through wetlands and everything is something new. Crep wetlands are a big thing in north central Iowa right now. The data on them is as limited, and the application isn't quite as straightforward as these management practices trap this much sediment. And that's one of the reasons why, as Sarah was explaining, that table's a little off there. But what that also means is that the traditional funding sources, whether it's NRCS, you got RCPP, you got WFPO, you got CIG through all those through NRCS, they're not going to be traditionally set up for this. EPA Section 319 in South Dakota, we've talked about this from the very onset. EPA Section 319 in Nebraska and Iowa, they do a lot of in-lake stuff. In South Dakota, they build terraces, and they do watershed-based practices. And again, it's good, it's source-based, it's progress, but none of you will, if that's how you're going to do it, none of you will ever see a change in Lake Mitchell in your lifetime. It's just not going to provide enough bang for the buck at that kind of a rate, time step. So that's the other thing that needs to happen in the next year is we need to talk to those people. So the bad news is it doesn't traditionally fit into those. The good news is things like NRCS, CIG, Conservation Innovation Grants. We're talking about trying something new here. And there's a lot of people in South Dakota and a lot of people who have other similar problems in their lakes that would benefit from a successful solution. So with respect to that, I think that's, we painted this the right way in terms of applications. Hopefully that's a benefit to this project to say, there's undoubtedly a lot of lakes in South Dakota that have a similar problem in other geographies. And so how can we do something here, and how can we get people to invest in something here so that 20 people don't have to fail in projects later on? And so that's how I kind of see moving forward is design refinement, and then we need to start sitting down and have some serious conversations with the state and federal potential funding agencies to determine what are our likely targets, because they're just not as straightforward as they would be in a normal project. So I thank everybody. A lot of information there. I know there's an event. We're going to stay here as long as anybody wants to chat, but right now we're happy to field any questions anybody has on information. Yes, sir.
You're talking about the water coming in upstream, right?
Yes, sir.
What about, you got like a dozen, 14 storm sewers coming into the lake? That can't be good either, is it?
So we accounted for urban inflow and what some of those are as part of the lake. So that was included in the watershed model. There is an urban component to that, and we applied similar concentrations. Exactly what they're draining right now, we haven't gone that far. Again, we're just using kind of across the board averages on some of those things, but they obviously are a contributor of phosphorus, especially urban practices like fertilizing lawns, et cetera. But I know you've already addressed some of those around the lake. Question is, in the city, like you mentioned, 12, 14 storm sewers, what are they draining? In the whole scheme of things, compared to 524 square miles, or 524, ratio above it, 351,000 acres, probably not as big as a deal, but from a standpoint of setting a precedent, very important. Yes, Steve?
In your table, you had 27 square miles of urban land use in the watershed and 29,000 acres of barren land. I find it hard to believe we have 27 square miles of urban land use, and I wanted to ask you how you're defining barren land.
I can speak first of all, that would be dependent on the underlying GIS data that we don't develop, that we utilize from state and federal agencies. And when we say urban, that would likely, and Sarah, you might be able to confirm or correct this, but that would include roads and right-of-ways, any small cities, small towns, add it all up. Yeah, anything that was developed property. So it's not truly urban when we think of like, you know, metropolitan areas, but any sort of developed land use for transportation, residential, commercial, industrial, anything like that.
So we didn't modify the data, Steve, we just imported it into the watershed software.
What is barren land?
That's a product of the underlying land use, and oftentimes it means there was a glitch, and you know, it's a lot of this is generated with by aerial methods, so it's somewhat what was the square? What was the acre?
29,000 acres of barren land.
Yeah, so likely it could be construction. It could be literally construction. I'm just giving you an example. It's going to be a mishmash of a lot of different things that they just couldn't classify when they crunched the data.
Further refining the model, if you want to hash those anomalies out, I mean, the proportion of 30,000 to 350 again is not huge, but it's not, you know, something we should totally neglect. So that would be a next step to refining the model.
If there is a load,
that.
there is a load. I mean, it's not like those are zero values. They're still considered in the model. It's just that what that exact land use is it's kind of an unknown is what it probably should be classified as.
Well, when you indicated that, you know, in this watershed, I mean, that's a typical agricultural watershed. And we have loading rates of 0.14 to 0.26 pounds per acre per year. But then you said that in typical problem areas, it's 3 to 4 pounds per acre. I mean, I find it hard to, this is a typical agricultural watershed. I find it hard to believe that it would not be typical in terms of phosphorus.
Those rates are straight from data that's been collected in the watershed in the last 25 years, combined with the USGS stream flow. But remember, we're talking about 524 acres to every acre, so the rates are low on a per acre basis, but you got a ratio of 10 times that.
Right. Why would the rates be 10 times that in other agricultural watersheds?
No, it's the ratio, it's that watershed.
He's saying the tonnage per year. So soil
Because the water
types.
yields are so low. Because the watershed yields are so low, and
The watershed yield here is 0.76 watershed inches per year. We didn't believe it. I mean, we're used to dealing 3s, 4s, and 5s. 0.76, so we went and did gauge analysis on, and originally USGS's watershed said 7.6, which is why we were getting some crazy numbers. So it's actually 0.76. We studied some watersheds around here and got similar numbers. So different soil types, low runoff rates, intensity of storms,
and I just want to stress, that's not a model number. That particular number is not a model number. That's a hard data number. It's not perfect, because there's always variance in data as well, but that's not something that we came up with. That's a calculation, not a prediction.
Some of it can be in your geology, right? This is the James Lobe that's been sediments brought down from Canada, left a lot of potholes. So there's a lot of things that don't necessarily connect with the drainage system, right? It may drain into a prairie pothole or drain into an isolated basin.
I'm just gonna say, pasture land absorbs water a lot faster than tilled land, is that not correct? Generally, I mean, once you've tilled up the land, doesn't a pasture absorb stuff more, and you get more runoff from a still piece of ground? So a lot of this watershed goes through pasture, so that might contribute to the fact that you have a lower runoff. I don't know, I'm just.
There's a lot of factors in that, soil types along with that, and also intensity of rainfall, because you got two things. You got initial abstraction, and then you got runoff. And there's literally these equations have like 15 variables in it. There's a lot of things that go into those.
If I broke that pounds per acre into cropland versus pasture land, we would probably see some differences. The numbers we're presenting are just, on average, this is what it equates to, and so.
And that's what I wanted to ask you, because you didn't actually go out and do any typical soil sampling in the watershed and look at water infiltration rates and things like that.
No.
And the reason I bring it up, the reason that I'm adamant that we need to be looking at the watershed is, here's an example. A guy I know, stories always start with a guy I know, right? The guy I know decided he was worried about soil health in his farmland, and he was gonna do something about it. He largely did it on his own about 10 years ago. And when he started, he had a water infiltration rate of 0.5 inch per hour. you get a 2-inch rainstorm in an hour, which we get all the time, 1.5 inches of that's gonna run off. If his farm's in this watershed, it ends up in Lake Mitchell. 1.5 inches out of 2 inches. 10 years after dedicating his farm to improving soil health, he has a water infiltration rate of 9 inches per hour. Now, we ever get, that is a fact, don't smirk. Do we ever get a thunderstorm that produces more than 9 inches per hour?
They exist, but
If
they're
he
pretty
did,
rare, yeah.
Right. He doesn't have any surface runoff on his farm anymore, other than perhaps in the spring when the ground is frozen. So there is a huge amount of benefit that can occur simply by improving soil health. And by the way, you know, just, if you're a farmer and you're worried about it, his input costs are down, his yields are up, his profitability's up, and he works half as much as he used to. So there's a story there.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take $87 million to get that story out there and to start changing behavior. It's education and maybe some good sample projects.
Right, and the last thing we want to do is for this report to dissuade that effort, so we can modify our scenario one accordingly, but I mean, the biggest problem with that might be the time frame in which it happens. And so I'm not an expert on ag practice, implementation. And so I will do more coordination with you and continue with NRCS to refine it. But I mean, again, I don't think we're gonna drop it to 2 million. And I don't think we're gonna have a timeline but so
Any ag practice that improves the bottom line to a farmer spreads like wildfire. I mean, if those things are available, yeah, we ought to be, singing them from the top of the roof. There's no doubt about it, because any farmer will do anything that improves their bottom line.
No.
That's 100% false statement.
Okay, so not any, but I would say, who wouldn't be interested in talking about that? If we can do things that show an improvement to a farmer's bottom line, someone certainly is going to be interested in talking about that. If those options are out there, then NRCS ought to be the people that, we work with through the TAT community to identify those practices and help sell them. But the bottom line is they haven't been able to in the watershed. They're either not happening, or they're not capable of happening everywhere. Sometimes it's site-specific stuff, Steve, you know that.
It's happening.
Yeah.
It's on a curve that is starting to go up dramatically. I mean, last year they had a soil health workshop here in town, standing room only. There were 300 people there, most of them local farmers. There's interest, people are listening, it's starting to take off.
Which is great news.
I mean, there's a new NWQI project in FYRA watershed, and I talked to Heidi, and she said, so this is where I'm getting my information. She said they hadn't had very many applications for this. I mean, it's specific to, it's putting higher priority on Firefield Creek, and they hadn't gotten any increased amount of applications due to that yet.
And we know why. I mean,
Okay.
it takes the right people out selling the program.
Okay.
I know there are several $1 million available right now.
Right.
In fairness to this argument, there are a lot of acres out there that need to be improved on farm ground on tilled ground. But there are also thousands of acres of pasture and clay soil and sand that you don't want tilled to make that improvement for infiltration. So in fairness, any farmer or anybody that manages soil wants the best soil, best infiltration rates without erosion that you can get. But I don't want to till all this pasture.
Right, one of the questions I wanted to ask is how much does phosphorus fertilizer cost?
It's expensive.
It's expensive.
You don't want to
Nobody wants to
waste it.
That's the key here. I mean, the farmers are on our side on this. They don't want to go buy more fertilizer.
If you can organically produce it through organics in the soil instead of applying it, you're thousands ahead.
But just a quick caution too, in this watershed, right? What infiltrates may not necessarily ultimately make it to the lake. And this lake relies on runoff, right? You see that from it dropping water level below the spillway during dry times. If there's no runoff in this watershed, there's no lake. And there's one thing I guarantee everybody wants in the lake is water.
Well, now, wait a minute. We face that too. When you start infiltrating water into the soil, where does it go?
It ends up in the creek anyway.
You hope, or it ends up getting evapotranspirated. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't pay attention to infiltration, but it's a sensitive balance in a watershed this size, because you can't neglect the benefit of runoff to the lake.
I guess I would say when the buffalo were here, don't you think there was enough water in Firestone Creek to fill Lake Mitchell?
There wasn't a reservoir.
I know, but if there had been, are you saying there would have been enough water in Firestone Creek to fill the reservoir?
I'm not trying to argue. I'm just saying as we approach these issues, right? It's very easy to get locked in on something and we have to pay attention to the whole water balance.
There's enough water in the creek to fill it 3 times a year right now, so.
So much of that comes during, your 2-hour event, so that's.
But the creek will run for months after we quit getting rain. Months. I live on it. I know it. It runs. And it goes over the spillway. Long after we've had a rain that actually put water into the creek. So it's infiltration that has to be moving through the soil, getting to the creek, and coming down.
It's both. It's a balance. You're right. It's both.
Let me ask one question. If you were to drain the lake and you started digging and you'd come upon Indian remains, how does that affect? Does it stop it right now?
Yeah, that would be a part of any project would be the NEPA process and doing
Well, I don't know if
tribal
you're
coordination.
familiar, but we've got the Indian village on the lake.
Yep.
My fear would be is you drained it, we'd run into
They've already
problem.
cut a
So-
lot of that bank, and just from doing trails around the entire lake, I mean, almost everything directly adjacent to the lake, next to the lake, next to the water, has been already cut at one point in time. So I'd be really surprised.
that'd be a fear.
It's a possibility, but, realistically,